December 1942. High above the Solomon Islands, a 19-year-old waist gunner named Eddie Kowalski grips the handles of his Browning M2 machine gun. The bomber shudders with every burst of enemy fire. Then, out of the bright Pacific sky, a Japanese Zero flashes across his view. Fast, sleek, deadly. Eddie does what every instinct tells him to do. He places the crosshairs right on the enemy plane and squeezes the trigger. A stream of 50 caliber bullets tears through the air and misses. Every tracer streaks harmlessly behind the Zero's tail. The enemy pilot doesn't even notice, he just keeps flying. Eddie's ammunition counter spins down to 0, and the enemy escapes untouched. This wasn't Eddie's fault. The same thing was happening across the skies of Europe and the Pacific. Thousands of American gunners, well-trained, brave, and armed with some of the finest weapons ever built, were missing almost every shot. In early 1943, the U.S. Army Air Forces analyzed hours of gun camera footage from bomber missions. The numbers were shocking. Trained gunners were scoring less than 4% hits against moving targets. That meant out of every 100 bullets fired, 96 hit nothing but empty air. It wasn't about courage or discipline. It wasn't about the quality of their weapon. The real enemy wasn't German or Japanese. It was physics. The average bomber gunner had just 8 to 10 seconds to track and shoot before a fighter moved out of range. A Browning M2 could fire about 13 rounds per second. In those 10 seconds, a gunner could unleash more than 100 rounds. Yet maybe 5 of them would actually strike the target. And that simply wasn't enough to bring down a fighter plane built to survive heavy damage. By 1943, the 8th Air Force was losing an average of 18 bombers every month over Europe. Each one carried 10 men. Nearly 2,000 airmen were killed, captured, or missing every 30 days. The bombers that made it home often came back riddled with holes, engines burning, and crew members wounded. The question no one could answer yet was simple. Why were America's best trained gunners missing almost everything they shot at? The answer lay not in the guns, not in the planes, but in a hidden flaw deep inside human instinct, an ancient habit that made perfect sense on the ground, but turned deadly in the air. Every gunner's instinct said the same thing. Put the sights on the enemy and pull the trigger. It's what works on a rifle range or while hunting a deer. But aerial combat was nothing like that. At 25,000 feet, planes weren't standing still. They were slicing through the air at more than 300 miles per hour. That speed created a problem that most gunners didn't even realize existed. When Eddie Kowalski fired at that Zero, his bullets left the barrel at nearly 2,900 feet per second, faster than sound. It sounded instantaneous, but in reality, those bullets needed about a third of a second to reach a target 300 yards away. In that brief moment, the enemy aircraft, moving at 300 miles per hour, had already traveled more than 130 feet forward, roughly the length of 11 cars. By the time Eddie's bullets arrived, the plane was long gone. He wasn't missing because he aimed badly. He was missing because he aimed at where the plane was, not where it would be. This invisible gap between where a target appears and where it actually will be when your bullets arrive had a name: deflection. And it was enormous. Against a fighter crossing at a 90-degree angle, a gunner needed to aim 15 to 20 feet ahead of the target's nose, at what looked like completely empty sky. Everything about that felt wrong. To aim so far in front of a target went against every instinct in the human brain. Even experienced marksmen struggled with it. During training, instructors tried to teach deflection shooting with diagrams and lectures, but almost no one could make it work under stress. The situation was even worse in combat. The deflection angle wasn't a fixed number. It changed every second, depending on the enemy's speed, distance, and direction. Was the fighter diving or climbing, coming straight in or moving across? Every variable demanded a new correction, and all of this had to be done in a few seconds, inside a freezing, vibrating aircraft, while tracers and cannon shells flew past. The result was chaos. Even when a gunner knew he needed to aim ahead, he often abandoned the idea after a few failed attempts. He would fire in front of the target, see his tracers streak through empty space, and assume he'd led too far. So on the next burst, he'd aim closer, right on the target, and miss again. Camera footage from 1943 showed the same pattern over and over. First bursts ahead, then each one walking backward until the gunner was shooting directly at, or even behind, the target. By the autumn of 1943, the cost of misunderstanding physics was visible across the skies of Europe. On a single raid to Schweinfurt in October, the 8th Air Force sent out 29 D-1 bombers. 60 never came back. The air war was reaching a breaking point. If the Allies couldn't find a way to help their gunners hit what they were shooting at, the bombing campaign itself might collapse. But buried deep in an old filing cabinet, someone was about to rediscover an idea that had predicted this very problem. Almost 20 years before the war even began, the answer to America's gunnery crisis had been written down. Almost 2 decades before the first B-17 ever took flight, it was sitting quietly in a military filing cabinet, forgotten by nearly everyone. The author was Lieutenant Colonel James Puckle, an artillery officer and instructor at the U.S. Army's Field Artillery School in the 1990s. He wasn't a famous inventor or a public figure, just a careful thinker who understood the language of physics as well as the rhythm of war. In 1924, Puckle wrote a paper titled The Problem of Lead in Aerial Gunnery. He had served in France during World War I and had seen firsthand the awkward, early attempts at shooting from one moving aircraft at another. Even back then, he realized that aviation was on the edge of a revolution, and that traditional marksmanship would soon become useless. Puckle did the math. He calculated that as aircraft speeds climbed beyond 150 miles per hour, the angles required to lead a target would exceed what the human mind could handle intuitively. Against a fighter moving at 250 miles per hour, a gunner would need to aim 4 or 5 full aircraft lengths ahead of where the target appeared. His paper included tables, charts, and formulas that laid it all out. A target crossing at 90 degrees at the same target at 400 yards, 94 feet. Those numbers looked absurd on paper, and yet they were mathematically correct. Puckle's conclusion was simple but alarming. Without mechanical or optical assistance, human gunners would soon be ineffective. It was a warning far ahead of its time. But the 1920s military establishment didn't grasp its urgency. Aviation was still young, and few aircraft could even reach the speeds Puckle described. His findings were archived, then forgotten. Over the next 2 decades, military aviation evolved at an astonishing pace. Engines grew stronger, airframes sleeker, and aircraft that once crawled through the sky at 100 miles per hour were now racing at 3 times that speed. Yet, gunnery training hardly changed at all. Instructors still taught the same fundamentals they had in 1918: sight picture, breath control, and trigger squeeze, as if air combat were just a faster version of target shooting on the ground. So when the United States entered World War II, in December 1941, its gunners carried the best machine guns in the world, but training based on the last war. The standard gunnery course lasted 4 weeks, and each trainee fired about 1,000 rounds total, mostly at slow, predictable towed targets. When those men climbed aboard bombers and met enemy fighters moving twice as fast as anything they had practiced against, their training failed instantly. By mid-1942, commanders were desperate for answers. That's when a young officer, named Captain Robert Williams, assigned to the 8th Air Force's Gunnery Analysis Section, began searching through old technical reports at Wright Field in Ohio. One afternoon, he opened a dusty folder labeled Puckle, JL. Inside were pages of calculations, neatly drawn diagrams, and a single underlined phrase that stopped him cold. As aircraft speed increases, human intuition will fail. Williams read the entire paper in one sitting. Then he wrote a memo to his commanding officer, with just 2 words underlined 3 times. He knew. 18 years earlier, Puckle had predicted exactly what was now happening. The missed shots, the impossible angles, the staggering losses. The math was sound, the conclusions inescapable. The only question left was this: if the human brain couldn't solve the problem fast enough, could something else do it for them? Before the Americans found Puckle's forgotten paper, the British had already stumbled onto a solution through trial, error, and desperation. It was the summer of 1940, and the Battle of Britain was raging. Every day, German bombers and fighters crossed the Channel to strike at cities and airfields, and every day, the Royal Air Force scrambled to stop them. The Spitfires and Hurricanes of Squadron 609, flying out of Middle Wallop, were among those on the front line. Their aircraft were excellent, their pilots brave and determined, but they had a problem no one expected. They were missing. Gun camera film showed that even experienced pilots were landing only about 6 hits out of every 100 rounds. Pilots were burning through their entire ammunition loads, sometimes 16 seconds of continuous fire, and watching enemy planes fly home untouched. The problem was the same one that haunted Eddie Kowalski and the American gunners later on: deflection. The planes were simply moving too fast for human reflexes to keep up. Squadron leader Horace "Hory" Darley decided something had to change. Darley had been a competitive clay pigeon shooter before the war, and he remembered how shotgun shooters learned to hit fast-moving targets, not by calculating angles, but by instinct. So he tried an experiment. In early August 1940, right in the middle of the battle, he grounded his entire squadron for 3 days, a risky move when every available fighter was needed in the air. On the first morning, he lined up his pilots on the gunnery range. A target banner was towed across the sky by another aircraft, but instead of telling his pilots to carefully aim and calculate their lead, Darley gave them an instruction that sounded almost reckless. Don't aim, feel it, fire while you're still turning. Let the target fly into your bullet. The first attempts were disastrous. Tracers streaked wide and low, missing by tens of meters, but Darley kept them at it. 40 passes each over 3 long days. No lectures, no mathematics, just repetition. And then something changed. By the 3rd day, the hits began to appear, slowly at first, then more consistently. The squadron's hit rate doubled, rising from 6% to around 12%. That small increase made a huge difference in combat. It meant twice as many German aircraft damaged or destroyed, and twice as many British pilots coming home alive. Darley wrote a report for Fighter Command summarizing what he had seen. His most important observation was simple: the pilots who improved fastest weren't the ones with the best test scores. They were the ones who could ignore their instinct to aim and instead trust their motion and timing. The human brain, Darley argued, was too slow for modern air combat. The conscious mind couldn't keep up, but the subconscious could, if it was trained through repetition. Fighter Command circulated his findings quietly. Some squadrons adopted the new motion-based deflection method immediately. Others dismissed it as unscientific, but those who used it noticed results. Their kill ratios climbed through the autumn of 1940, helping tip the balance in the skies over Britain. Across the Atlantic, American observers took careful note. They saw that the British had found a way to fight the physics problem, not by calculating faster, but by letting instinct take over. For fighter pilots, this made sense. But for bomber crews locked in place inside a massive B-17, it wouldn't be enough. A pilot could use the motion of his aircraft to create the proper lead. A gunner standing in a fixed turret could not. If instinct and training couldn't solve it for the gunners, then maybe machinery could. By 1943, the U.S. Army Air Forces had learned the hard way that courage and instinct alone couldn't win an air battle. Human reflexes were simply too slow for the physics of modern aerial combat. If gunners couldn't calculate deflection fast enough, perhaps a machine could. That challenge fell to a group of engineers at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, inside a place called the Radiation Laboratory. The name was a deliberate disguise. It made the project sound like atomic research. hiding its true purpose, developing advanced fire control systems. The head of the lab was Dr. Charles Stark Draper, a 40-year-old engineer and professor with an extraordinary talent for turning physics into practical tools. Draper had spent years designing gyroscopes for aircraft navigation. He understood that gunnery wasn't just about aiming, it was about prediction. If a gunner could somehow see where his target would be a fraction of a second in the future, not where it was now, he could hit it every time. Draper and his team built a device to make that possible, the Mark 14 computing gun sight. At first glance, it looked like a heavy, complicated optical sight. Inside, though, it was something entirely new, a miniature analog computer, made of gears, cams, and gyroscopes. Here's how it worked. The gunner would look through the sight and adjust a dial to match the target's wingspan. That told the sight the target's range. Then, as he tracked the enemy aircraft for about 2 seconds, the gyroscope measured how fast the target was moving across his field of vision. The gun sight took that information, the range, the angular speed, and the known ballistics of the .50 caliber bullet, and solved the deflection equation 30 times per second. What it displayed was nothing short of revolutionary. A glowing dot, projected into the glass ahead of the target. That dot showed exactly where to fire, so the bullets in the enemy aircraft would arrive at the same point in space. The Mark 14 didn't ask the gunner to think. It did the thinking for him. When the first prototypes were tested at the Naval Air Station in Norfolk, Virginia, the results were almost unbelievable. Gunners who had struggled to score even 5% hits suddenly achieved 18% on their first day. After a week of practice, their hit rates climbed above 20. In practical terms, that meant 5 times more hits and 5 times more downed enemy aircraft without changing the gun or the ammunition. The only downside was time. The Mark 14 was complex, heavy, and expensive. Mass production didn't begin until early 1944. An installation took priority for new aircraft rolling off assembly lines. Most bombers already in service would have to keep using simpler iron or reflector sights. For thousands of crews still flying missions over Europe and the Pacific, the solution came too late. They needed something they could use right now. A method that didn't require new technology, electricity, or months of waiting. And surprisingly, that next breakthrough didn't come from scientists or officers. It came from a combat gunner who had spent months in the thick of battle and who carried his answer in a small hand-drawn notebook. By early 1944, 2 parallel approaches to the deflection problem existed. High-tech devices, like the Mark 14, that could compute lead for a gunner, and training techniques that tried to rewire a shooter's instincts. But most crews were stuck with neither. They still had basic sights and little time. The urgent need was for a simple, reliable method that could be taught quickly, used with existing equipment, and trusted in the chaos of combat. The breakthrough arrived humbly. In a notebook, Staff Sergeant William Bill Fleming was not a laboratory engineer or a doctrinal reformer. He was a combat gunner in the Pacific, a man whose life in 1943-44 was measured in missions, gallons of tracer smoke, and the hard lessons that come from surviving when others did not. Fleming had fired tens of thousands of rounds and had watched patterns emerge, not as equations, but as repeated, practical experience. He kept a small notebook where he sketched enemy aircraft and drew lines forward from their noses, showing where he had actually aimed when he scored hits. Those sketches were striking in their simplicity. Instead of arcane measurements, Fleming's notes used a visual reference every gunner could understand at a glance. Aircraft lengths. 1 length ahead for a slight crossing shot, 2 lengths for a moderate angle, 3 or more for steep lateral passes. In combat, a measurement expressed as 50 feet meant little. A measurement expressed as 2 fuselage lengths was immediate and usable. The plane itself became the ruler. On March 14, 1944, Fleming shared his notebook during a debriefing with Lieutenant Commander Edward Butch O'Hare, a respected tactician and Medal of Honor recipient. O'Hare recognized the strength of Fleming's empirical approach. Here was a real-world metric, refined under fire, that could be taught simply and practiced immediately. He ordered Fleming to run training for the entire air group. The method they developed was straightforward and practical, designed for speed and retention. On the carrier deck, a crewman would hold a small model airplane mounted on a pole and walk or run it past a gunner at varying speeds and angles. Gunners stood in their mounting positions and practiced aiming not at the model itself, but ahead of it, counting plane lengths into the empty space. Instructors guided them. 1 length for slight crossing angles, 2 for moderate crossings, 3 or more for steeper approaches. The drills were repeated until the motion felt familiar. Keep the target moving through your sight. Commit to the forward aim. Fire while your hands and eyes are still tracking, and trust that the rounds will meet the plane. What made Fleming's spot shooting method powerful was that it translated an abstract ballistic correction into a visual, repeatable habit that did not require conscious trigonometry. The brain is exceptionally good at judging relative size and motion. It is poor at translating those impressions into absolute distance. By anchoring the lead to the visible size of the enemy aircraft, Fleming removed the need for abstract numbers and created a mental shortcut that could survive the pressure of combat. The carrier tested the method in real operations. Commanders measured results by comparing ammunition expenditure and confirmed hits before and after the training. The improvement was real and rapid. Gunners who had been averaging about 4.2 hits per 100 rounds against crossing targets increased their effectiveness to 9.1 hits per 100 rounds within 6 weeks. That was more than double the previous rate. In practical terms, it meant more enemy planes damaged or destroyed per engagement, and fewer attackers returning to fight another day. Word spread quickly through the Pacific Fleet. Variants of Fleming's spot shooting appeared aboard carriers, such as the Essex, Enterprise, and Bunker Hill. Each unit adjusted the basic idea to fit its own crews. Some emphasized wingspan rather than fuselage length for certain target types. Others integrated simulated bursts and immediate feedback to speed learning. But the core principle remained unchanged. Give gunners a simple visual rule tied to the apparent size of the target, not an abstract calculation. The method's adoption moved beyond the Navy. The U.S. Army Air Forces observed the improvements and began incorporating similar techniques into their training programs. In mid-1944, the 8th Air Force Gunnery School in England rebuilt portions of its curriculum around these visual measures, calling the approach by names such as radius of action, shooting, or simply teaching lead in multiples of target wingspan. The effect showed up in operational statistics. Bomber losses per mission, while still significant, began to decline as more gunners received realistic practice and internalized forward aim habits. But spot shooting was not a magical cure. It solved many practical problems, but could still fail under severe stress. Psychologists embedded with the Air Forces observed a phenomenon they called threat fixation collapse. As an attacker closed, gunners' fear reflexes often forced their aim backward toward the visible threat, undoing the training. The simple visual rule worked best when it had been drilled to the point of automatic behavior, when leading by plane lengths was as natural as walking or catching a ball. That level of automaticity required repetition, ammunition, and time, all in scarce supply during the early years of the bombing campaign. To address this, training programs were expanded, where the standard course had once been 4 weeks, with roughly 1,000 rounds. By late 1944, many schools extended training to 8 or 10 weeks and increased live fire practice to several thousand rounds, with a major portion devoted to moving targets at realistic speeds. The Navy's Gunnery School in Jacksonville, Florida, introduced high-intensity drills, motorized turrets, rapid elevation changes, and fast towing boats that mimicked combat turbulence and taught the eyes and hands to work together under stress. Instructors emphasized repetition over lecture. See, shoot. Check the pattern, adjust, and shoot again. Over time, a noticeable stratification emerged among crews. Veteran gunners, who had survived dozens of missions and heavy practice sessions, performed reliably. Their lead points remained steady, even in close violent attacks. Novices, or those who had little live fire time, reverted more quickly to instinctive aiming under stress. Commanders learned to value the placement of experienced men in key stations and to build formations around reliable defenders. Fleming's spot shooting was successful because it fit the realities of human perception and the limits of wartime logistics. It gave crews a low-tech, highly effective tool that compensated for the lack of immediate widespread high-tech solutions. It also showed a vital cultural point. Sometimes the most useful innovations in war come not from ivory towers, but from people in the field who translate experience into a practical rule that others can use. By the summer of 1944, machines and training were working together. The Mark 14 and its successors offered precise mechanical prediction where available. Spot shooting gave every gunner a low-cost, immediate way to fight the physics problem when technology was absent. Both approaches shared a single recognition. You had to aim where the target would be, not where it was. The rest was the harder task, ensuring that, under fire, people actually remembered and acted on that lesson. By mid-1944, Fleming's spot shooting method had spread across the Allied air forces, and mechanical gun sights like the Mark 14 were finally appearing on new bombers. Yet even with better tools and smarter training, one stubborn obstacle remained: human instinct. Gunners understood the physics. They could recite the correct lead distances in a classroom. But once combat began, once tracers flashed by, and enemy fighters dived straight toward them, instinct took over. Under fear and adrenaline, most men reverted to what felt natural: aiming directly at the visible threat. Army psychologists studying gun camera footage called this reaction threat fixation collapse. Gunners would begin an engagement using proper lead, but as the danger increased, their aim drifted backward until they were firing right at the target's nose and missing again. The only real cure was repetition. Deflection shooting had to move beyond conscious thought and become automatic, like walking or throwing a ball. That required time, ammunition, and constant practice. By late 1944, gunnery schools adjusted. Training courses doubled in length, and students fired thousands of rounds at fast-moving targets instead of static ones. The goal was no longer just to teach deflection shooting. It was to burn it into muscle memory. The best gunners eventually reached what instructors called no mind, a calm state under pressure where their hands and eyes worked independently of conscious fear. They no longer thought about angles or distances. They simply saw, tracked, and fired, and their bullets found their mark. It was proof that with enough training, even instinct could be rewritten. By the summer of 1944, the skies over Europe were beginning to change. The Allies had not yet won air supremacy, but for the first time, the balance was shifting in their favor. The reason wasn't just new aircraft or more bombs. It was something less visible, a quiet revolution in how people aimed and thought. Months earlier, the 8th Air Force had faced staggering losses. Entire bomber groups disappeared over Germany, brought down by enemy fighters whose attacks the gunners could barely touch. But now, after thousands of hours of retraining, better coordination, and smarter technology, the numbers began to tell a different story. At gunnery schools in England and the United States, the old 4-week courses had been replaced with 10-week programs that emphasized realistic combat drills. Students no longer shot at slow, predictable towed targets. Instead, they faced high-speed, erratically moving ones that mimicked real attacks. Motorized turrets swung, rocked, and vibrated, just like the ones on a flying B-7. Instructors stopped giving long lectures about trigonometry and simply said, shoot, check, adjust, and shoot again. In Florida, the Naval Air Gunner School introduced a new exercise that looked more like chaos than a classroom. Boats towed targets across open water at 60 miles per hour, while gunners strapped into spinning mounts tracked and fired. The goal wasn't perfection, It was instinct. After hundreds of repetitions, deflection shooting became as natural as blinking. By mid-year, that training began to pay off. Bomber crews returning from deep strike missions over Germany reported that enemy fighters were being hit more often and breaking off their attacks sooner. Mission reports from July 1944 showed average bomber losses of about 3.4% per mission, compared to more than 5% the previous autumn. It might sound like a small change, but across hundreds of bombers, it meant hundreds of airmen coming home alive each month. Equally important was morale. Gunners who once felt powerless now saw results. They watched enemy aircraft take damage, burst into flame, or peel away trailing smoke. The difference wasn't bravado, it was confidence, born from understanding. They had learned, at last, to trust physics over instinct. Inside the formations, that change was palpable. When enemy fighters attacked, the defensive fire came faster, heavier, and far more accurate. German pilots soon learned to identify which formations were manned by veterans, those that met every attack with precise, concentrated bursts, and which were filled with new crews whose tracers wandered behind. They avoided the veterans whenever possible. Technology and training were converging. New aircraft rolled off assembly lines already fitted with the Mark 14 computing gun sight, giving their crews the same predictive advantage once reserved for a handful of test units. Line. Veterans shared their experience with new recruits. Simple advice like 2 lengths ahead for a crossing shot or never chase your tracers, trust your lead. Step by step, a change born from desperation became standard practice. The skies that had once belonged to the Luftwaffe were no longer so safe. Allied bombers reached deeper into Germany, hitting factories, oil refineries, and rail hubs that the enemy could no longer defend as easily. The air war was far from over, but the outcome was no longer in doubt. In all of it, the improved hit rates, the lower losses, the growing confidence, traced back to one realization that had taken years, countless lives, and endless training to master. To survive in the air, you had to aim at nothing visible and trust that the invisible was real. When the guns finally fell silent in 1945, the lessons of aerial gunnery didn't fade, they evolved. The discovery that success in combat depended on prediction, not reaction, became the foundation of modern fire control. The Mark 14 gun sight inspired a new generation of devices, from the Mark 18, used in Korea, to the radar-assisted systems of the jet age. By the time of Vietnam, pilots no longer guessed at lead angles. Onboard computers did the math in milliseconds. But the principle never changed. Whether guiding a bullet, a missile, or an automated defense cannon, every system was solving the same problem Eddie Kowalski faced over the Solomons: hitting a moving target by aiming at where it will be, not where it is. Even as technology advanced, Air forces kept deflection shooting in their training programs. Fighter schools like Top Gun continued to teach gun-only engagements, not because pilots expected to duel with cannons, but because it taught them spatial awareness and anticipation, the same instincts that once saved bomber crews. The old gunner's struggle had become the blueprint for a new era of precision warfare. What began as a desperate fix in 1943 ended as a timeless lesson in human adaptation. When instinct fails, understanding can take its place. In the end, the story of deflection shooting was never just about bullets or machinery. It was about people, young men, who had to unlearn what instinct told them and trust what reason demanded. When Eddie Kowalski fired his first burst over the Solomon Islands, he did everything he thought was right. He aimed at what he saw, pulled the trigger, and missed. 2 years later, men like him were aiming at empty air and watching enemy fighters fall in flames. Nothing about the sky had changed, only their understanding of it. The transformation from a 4% hit rate in 1943 to more than 20% by late 1944 wasn't driven by luck or numbers. It came from a rare mix of science, experience, and humility, from those willing to question centuries of marksmanship tradition and admit that instinct could be wrong. That shift echoed far beyond World War II. It shaped how militaries, engineers, and even everyday people approached fast, complex problems. The principles behind those bomber turrets evolved into radar locks, guided missiles, and modern computer targeting. Yet the underlying idea remains the same. Prediction beats reaction. Understanding beats assumption. Today, whether it's a pilot guiding a jet, a sailor operating a defense system, or even a gamer leading a virtual target, they're all following the same invisible logic discovered in Blood and Fire over Europe and the Pacific. The logic of empty sky. The men who learned to fire at nothing visible left behind more than tactics. They left proof of what humans can do when survival forces them to think differently. They showed that instinct isn't destiny, that with knowledge, repetition, and courage, people can rewire their reactions to meet reality head-on. And so, every time someone pulls a trigger, makes a calculation, or trusts a prediction rather than a feeling, a small part of that legacy still lives. The legacy of those gunners who learned to aim, not at what was, but at what was coming.